As the sun sets over a beautiful wedding ceremony, Abigail and Marcus, surrounded by loved ones, are enjoying one of the happiest moments of their lives. Abigail, a well-respected judge, and Marcus, a high-ranking FBI agent, stand together in love, celebrating their union in the backyard of their home. However, their joyful evening takes a sudden and dark turn when a prejudiced neighbor calls the police, fabricating a story of suspicion. The arrival of officers, their unwarranted hostility, and the ensuing confrontation quickly transform the celebration into a night of tension and fear. Will Abigail and Marcus find justice in the face of injustice? If you are not subscribed, I recommend you subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any videos. A racist neighbor, Mrs. Rose, an elderly woman known for her sharp tongue and nosy demeanor, decided to call the police during the wedding of Abigail and Marcus, the beloved couple celebrating their union. To her surprise, the officers who responded did so with unexpected brutality, leading to several arrests at the joyful event. However, when the true identities of the bride and groom were revealed, the situation took a dramatic turn, leading to unforeseen consequences for Mrs. Rose. Will Abigail and Marcus find a way to seek justice amidst this chaos? Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any of the unfolding stories, and we invite you to share in the comments where you're tuning in from. As the sun began to set over the beautifully manicured hedges of the upscale neighborhood, it cast a warm, golden glow across the spacious backyard of a large, elegantly appointed house. The air was alive with the cheerful murmur of guests mingling and celebrating under strings of twinkling lights that danced in the gentle breeze. The intoxicating aroma of flowers from the meticulously arranged centerpieces wafted through the air, adding a natural elegance to the joyous occasion. It was the perfect evening for a wedding, and the smiles adorning the faces of everyone present reflected the deep love and hope shared by the newlyweds. Standing amid their family and friends, Abigail and Marcus epitomized happiness. Abigail, a respected judge renowned for her integrity and unwavering commitment to justice, radiated beauty in her stunning white dress, her smile shining as brightly as the sun sinking on the horizon. Beside her stood Marcus, her husband and a high-ranking FBI agent who exuded strength and pride. He draped his arm affectionately around her shoulders, his eyes filled with deep admiration as he gazed at her. The love they shared was palpable, evident in every stolen glance and softly spoken word exchanged between them. Their guests mirrored their joy, thrilled to be part of this momentous day. The couple had chosen to host their wedding at their home, a place that symbolized their shared dreams and the life they had built together. Marcus had poured countless hours into transforming their backyard into a space that felt both intimate and expansive, designed for their closest friends and family to gather in celebration. Abigail's parents moved through the crowd, beaming with pride as they shared heartwarming stories from her childhood and offered their heartfelt congratulations. Meanwhile, Marcus's family, many of whom had traveled long distances to attend, laughed and raised their glasses in toasts to the newlyweds' promising future, their voices blending harmoniously with the soft music drifting through the air. Unbeknownst to the celebrants, just a few houses down the street, Mrs. Rose sat in her dimly lit living room, her eyes peering through lace curtains with an intensity that betrayed her discontent. Long regarded as the neighborhood busybody, she had always taken it upon herself to meddle in the affairs of others, her disdain for anything or anyone she deemed out of place festering within her. Today, as she watched the vibrant gathering in Marcus and Abigail's backyard, her face twisted into a deep frown, etching lines of disapproval across her features. Having witnessed many celebrations over her years in the neighborhood, Mrs. Rose's anger boiled at the sight of what she considered an inappropriate gathering. Fueled by her prejudices, she reached for her phone, her bony fingers gripping it tightly as she dialed a number she knew all too well. With a voice sharp and accusatory, she spun a tale of loud noise and suspicious activity coming from the house down the street, hinting at potential criminal behavior with thinly veiled prejudice that dripped from her every word. By the time she hung up, Mrs. Rose had successfully painted a distorted picture of a joyful gathering, turning it into a scene of chaos in her mind. At the precinct, the dispatcher received her call, and a few officers on duty exchanged curious glances. It was a quiet evening, and the prospect of responding to a call about a potential disturbance in an affluent neighborhood piqued their interest. Without hesitation, a team of officers was dispatched to the scene, their expressions hardening with anticipation as they made their way toward the address. As they approached, the festive atmosphere would soon clash violently with the brutality that was about to unfold, setting the stage for a confrontation that would change everything. Meanwhile, back at the house, the atmosphere was filled with an untroubled bliss, completely oblivious to the storm looming on the horizon. Inside, Abigail was engrossed in a heartfelt conversation with her childhood friend, the two of them reminiscing about the days of their youth. Their laughter rang out like music, creating a sense of nostalgia and joy that enveloped the room. In a nearby corner, Marcus was animatedly discussing plans for an upcoming family reunion with his uncle, sharing stories that only families can appreciate. Outside, the children dashed around the yard, their joyful shouts intermingling with the cheerful clinking of glasses as guests made a toast to the happy couple. The guests, enveloped in the festive ambience, remained blissfully unaware of the mounting tension that simmered just beyond the edges of their celebration. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 1 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the gathering, the sky transformed into a breathtaking canvas of deep pink and purple hues. Abigail and Marcus found a moment to steal away for a dance, their movements fluid and graceful as they swayed to the music. Friends and family formed a circle around them, clapping in rhythm and cheering, their faces glowing with happiness under the twinkling fairy lights that adorned the yard. It was a fleeting moment they would cherish forever, a perfect snapshot of love and unity, untouched by the chaos brewing beyond their property lines. Yet, beyond the neatly trimmed hedge that bordered their idyllic setting, headlights cut through the encroaching dusk, illuminating the darkness with an unwelcome glare. The deep rumble of police cars as they rolled to a stop shattered the evening's harmony, though it took a few moments for the commotion to register with those in the yard. Officers emerged from their vehicles, adjusting their belts and exchanging brief, serious remarks as they prepared to approach the festive gathering. Their eyes swept over the scene, but their expressions betrayed no understanding of the joyful occasion unfolding before them. The first hint of trouble materialized when one of the younger guests caught sight of the flashing lights dancing across the windows of the house. A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd as more and more people turned to see the line of police cars parked conspicuously outside their celebration. Marcus, sensing the sudden shift in the mood, gently took Abigail's hand and guided her toward the source of the disturbance. His expression, once brimming with joy, now reflected a deepening concern that weighed heavily on him. "What's going on?" Abigail asked, her brow furrowed in worry as she stole a glance at the officers. Marcus squeezed her hand reassuringly, but the knot of anxiety forming in his chest told him something was amiss. He observed the determination etched into the officers' faces as they advanced toward the gathering, their hands resting ominously on their holsters. The lead officer, a tall figure with a stern countenance, stepped forward, his voice slicing through the night air like a knife. "We've received reports of a disturbance in this area. Everyone needs to remain where they are." Marcus and Abigail exchanged a quick, apprehensive glance, silently agreeing to maintain their composure amidst the brewing tension. Abigail, ever the poised professional, stepped forward to engage with the officers. "Good evening, officers. This is a private event, our wedding. Actually, is there a misunderstanding?" she inquired, her voice steady despite the undercurrents of worry. The officer's gaze swept over the gathering, his frown deepening. "We've received reports of suspicious activity and potential noise violations. We're going to need to investigate." Marcus felt a tightening in his stomach, recognizing that tone of voice, the one that dismissed any explanation before it had a chance to be articulated. Nevertheless, he kept his voice measured as he replied, "Officer, we assure you this is simply a wedding celebration. We'd be happy to answer any questions you have, but there's no reason for concern here." The officer's expression remained unyielding, a steely determination evident in his demeanor. He gestured to his fellow officers, who began to disperse throughout the crowd, moving with an air of authority that sent a chill through the celebration. The guests, who had initially thought this might merely be a simple misunderstanding, began to shift uneasily as the officers questioned them, their demeanor far from friendly. Abigail's parents, standing on the sidelines, watched with growing anxiety, their faces paling under the warm lights of the yard. Meanwhile, Marcus's brother, a lawyer by profession, tried to interject, offering his legal expertise in an attempt to defuse the situation. However, he was swiftly brushed off by the officers, who seemed resolutely uninterested in listening to any explanations. The atmosphere, once filled with joy and laughter, now crackled with an unsettling tension that threatened to overshadow the celebration. The joyful atmosphere of the evening, once vibrant and full of laughter, was rapidly dissolving into confusion and fear, casting a shadow over what should have been a momentous occasion. Abigail felt a tight knot of frustration growing in her chest, the kind that comes when you sense something deeply unsettling just beneath the surface. Despite the rising anxiety threatening to overwhelm her, she took a deep breath, focusing on the soothing rhythm of her inhalations, reminding herself to remain calm and collected. She understood that if they were going to de-escalate the situation brewing around them, it was crucial to keep their heads cool and composed. Beside her, Marcus stood resolutely, his hand resting reassuringly on her shoulder, providing a steady presence amidst the gathering storm of rising tension and uncertainty. Yet, despite their best efforts to maintain a sense of normalcy, they could both feel the unmistakable shift in the atmosphere. The unspoken prejudice lurking in the way the officers looked at them, the dismissive tone that crept into their voices as they began their inquiries. Abigail glanced sideways at Marcus, and in that fleeting moment, she saw the same realization dawning in his eyes. This wasn't going to be a simple conversation. It was the unsettling beginning of something much more troubling than either of them had anticipated. The chapter ended with Abigail and Marcus standing together, resolutely facing the officers who were determined to find fault where none existed. Unbeknownst to them, this confrontation was on the brink of spiraling out of control, threatening to overshadow what should have been the happiest day of their lives. As the officers continued to weave through the gathering, the festive atmosphere dissipated entirely, replaced by an uneasy silence that settled over the backyard like a dense fog, stifling the joy that had permeated the air just moments before. The flashing blue and red lights of the squad cars cast eerie reflections off the faces of the guests, who exchanged nervous glances and whispered among themselves, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern. For a brief moment, it felt as if time had frozen. An event meant to celebrate love and unity was now being overshadowed by the heavy weight of suspicion and doubt. Abigail and Marcus remained steadfast, side by side, their hands subtly clasped together as they watched the officers interact with their friends and family. The officers spoke with an air of impatience and condescension, their demeanor unmistakably authoritative. The tone of their inquiries was glaringly clear. Questions were not the polite inquiries of officers seeking to uphold the law but thinly veiled accusations that hung in the air like a noxious cloud. With every dismissive glance and terse response that the officers offered to their guests, Abigail could feel her pulse quickening, a mix of anger and indignation rising within her. "Excuse me, officer," Abigail called out, her voice calm yet firm as she stepped forward to approach the lead officer, who had been the first to address them. "I understand that you are responding to a report, but I can assure you that there is absolutely no criminal activity occurring here. This is a private event, and we have all the necessary permits in place. We are not in violation of any local ordinances." The officer turned to face her, his gaze sweeping over her with a mixture of skepticism and annoyance, as if he were weighing her words against the weight of his authority. "We'll be the judge of that, ma'am," he replied, his tone dripping with condescension. He took a step closer, his hand resting on his belt as if to assert his dominance in the conversation. "We need to conduct our investigation, so I suggest you cooperate. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 2 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time." Marcus, sensing the tension escalating, stepped forward beside Abigail, his expression controlled but unmistakably serious. "Officer, my wife is a judge," he stated firmly, his voice even but carrying an undeniable weight. "We are more than familiar with the law, and we know our rights. There is no need for this level of scrutiny in a private gathering." The officer's eyes flicked toward Marcus, and a faint, disdainful smile twisted his lips, a clear indication of his disregard. "A judge? Huh," he muttered as if the title held little consequence in the grand scheme of things. "Well, that doesn't change the fact that we received reports of possible illegal activities on this property. We need to verify what's going on." Nearby, Marcus's brother, who had overheard the exchange and was visibly agitated, stepped forward as well, ready to defend their rights. "I'm a lawyer," he interjected, his tone urgent. "I can confirm that everything here is in order. If you need any documents or permits, we'd be more than happy to provide them." But instead of acknowledging the offer, the officer simply waved his hand dismissively, a gesture that carried a chilling finality. "Step back," he barked, his voice authoritative and harsh. "We don't need any help from you." It was a clear message. The officers had no interest in being reasonable or cooperative. They were here to assert their authority, and the legal knowledge of the guests, no matter how extensive, was not going to deter them from their mission. The officers began to question the guests more aggressively, their words laced with insinuations that were hard to miss. When one elderly guest, visibly shaken, attempted to explain that this was a wedding celebration and not some sort of suspicious gathering, the officer responded with a curt, "We'll see about that," dismissing the guest's attempt to clarify the situation. Abigail's father, noticing the rising tension and the palpable anxiety among the guests, tried to step in and defuse the situation. "Please, officers, there's no need for this," he said, his voice steady but tinged with concern. "We are law-abiding citizens. There's nothing here that warrants such." "Sir, step back," the lead officer snapped, abruptly cutting off Marcus mid-sentence. The sharpness of his command left no room for negotiation. "We'll decide what warrants our attention here." As Marcus processed the officer's dismissive tone, he noticed another officer conducting a pat-down on a young teenage guest who had come with his family. The boy looked frightened, his eyes wide with fear, as he stood there with his hands raised high, almost as if surrendering to an unseen threat. "Is this necessary?" Marcus called out, his voice rising slightly in a mix of indignation and concern. "That's a child. He's done nothing wrong." Yet, the officer remained indifferent, his focus locked on the boy, continuing the search with a roughness that made the child wince visibly. Marcus's heart sank as he witnessed this scene unfold. He glanced at Abigail, whose frustration was palpable as she observed how the officers seemed to be disproportionately targeting the youngest and oldest members of the crowd, employing intimidation tactics that felt designed to disempower the entire group. "Officer," she said, her tone now sharper and more assertive as she stepped closer to the lead officer, "you're overstepping your bounds. You have no valid grounds to be searching our guests like this." Her words were steady, though tinged with urgency, as she sought to reclaim some sense of justice in the chaos. The lead officer turned to face her, his expression hardening, as if her challenge only further fueled his authority. "Ma'am, if you continue to interfere with our investigation, we'll have to take action against you." His voice was cold, and the threat hung in the air like a heavy fog, causing an uncomfortable silence among the guests, who seemed to collectively hold their breath. Instinctively, Marcus placed a hand on Abigail's arm, not to restrain her, but as a silent reminder that they needed to maintain their composure, even in the face of such outrageous behavior from the officers. Abigail took a step back, her jaw clenched in determination. "I'm not interfering," she said, her voice steady yet firm. "I'm exercising my rights and the rights of everyone here to be treated with respect and fairness." The lead officer's gaze darkened further, his patience wearing thin. "I suggest you start cooperating, ma'am," he said, his tone dripping with menace, "or you'll find yourself in the back of a squad car." The aggressive tone did not escape the notice of the other guests, many of whom began to voice their concerns in defense of Abigail and Marcus. "You can't do this," one man exclaimed, his voice raised in protest. "They haven't done anything wrong," another woman added, her voice trembling with indignation. "This is harassment. There's no reason for any of this." However, as the guests protested, the officers seemed to dig in their heels, their demeanor shifting from authoritative to hostile. Two officers began to separate the guests into smaller groups, while others demanded identification, transforming the festive backyard of a wedding into a scene reminiscent of a police investigation. As Marcus watched the scene unfold, a sinking feeling grew in the pit of his stomach. He had faced numerous challenging situations throughout his career, but never had he felt so helpless, so powerless against the tide of injustice washing over them. This blatant disregard for the law was not merely an instance of authority being misused. It was a manifestation of unspoken prejudice, a judgment that equated the color of their skin with suspicion. Abigail's mother, visibly shaken and frightened by the unfolding chaos, reached out to her daughter, her voice trembling with anxiety. "Abigail, what are we going to do?" Abigail squeezed her mother's hand reassuringly, even as her own heart raced with a tumult of anger and fear. "We're not going to let them intimidate us," she replied, her voice calm and resolute, despite the turmoil swirling inside her. "We have the law on our side." Yet, even as she spoke those words of determination, she couldn't help but notice the smirks on some of the officers' faces, a cruel display of their enjoyment in wielding power over the vulnerable. One officer began to stride toward the house, seemingly intent on searching the premises without so much as a hint of consent. Abigail quickly moved to intercept him, her resolve hardening. "You need a warrant to enter the house," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "You don't have one, so stay where you are." The officer glanced back at Abigail with a look of contempt that was unmistakable in its severity. "Lady, don't tell me how to do my job," he retorted sharply, his tone dripping with disdain as he resumed his determined stride toward the house, seemingly oblivious to the gravity of the situation. In a swift, protective motion, Marcus stepped in front of him, effectively blocking his path. "You heard my wife," he stated, his voice steady yet imbued with firmness. "You don't have the authority to enter our home without a warrant." His words hung in the air, a clear challenge to the officer's unwarranted advance. The officer's hand twitched reflexively toward his holster, a subtle but unmistakable gesture that conveyed a chilling threat. "Step aside," he ordered, his voice low and menacing, as if he believed his uniform granted him the right to intimidate. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 3 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Marcus stood his ground, unwavering, meeting the officer's gaze with unyielding resolve. "Not until you respect our rights," he asserted, the strength in his voice echoing his determination to defend his family's sanctity. In that tense moment, it became painfully clear to everyone present that this conflict transcended a simple noise complaint or a mere misunderstanding. The officer's behavior had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed, and the atmosphere thickened with an unspoken understanding that the situation was spiraling towards something far more serious than anyone had anticipated. The next steps taken in this encounter would critically determine whether it culminated in mere words or devolved into a violent confrontation. As the chapter came to a close, Abigail and Marcus remained resolute, standing firm against the mounting pressure of the officers pressing forward, their steadfastness setting the stage for a confrontation that would test their courage and challenge the very justice that Abigail had devoted her life to upholding. The evening sky, once painted in vibrant hues of twilight, had now succumbed to deep and unsettling darkness, the only illumination coming from the flashing red and blue lights of the police vehicles that stood ominously parked in front of their home. The mood in the backyard had shifted from anxious murmurs of confusion to a tangible sense of fear, as it became glaringly evident that the situation was spiraling swiftly out of control. The number of officers had now swelled to more than a dozen, and they began to tighten their grip on the gathering, their demeanor turning increasingly hostile. Their actions, initially framed as an investigation into a supposed disturbance, had morphed into an aggressive display of power, intent on asserting dominance rather than seeking a resolution. Guests who had initially attempted to reason with the officers were now subjected to harsh commands and rough handling, as if the backyard had transformed into a battleground where authority was being violently enforced. At the center of this chaos, Abigail and Marcus stood resolute, desperately trying to maintain their ground as the officer's aggression intensified around them. Despite her position as a judge, Abigail found that it offered little protection. If anything, it appeared to provoke the officers even further. When she asserted her authority and reminded them of the legal limitations on their actions, she was met with scornful glares and mocking laughter that echoed through the night air. "Judge or not, you're in no position to give orders," one officer sneered dismissively, shoving past her with a deliberate show of disregard. The dismissiveness in his voice cut through her like a knife, igniting a fire within Abigail. She refused to be silenced, her resolve hardening. She was not about to allow the situation to devolve into chaos without putting up a fight. On the edge of the backyard, a small group of guests had been forced to kneel on the ground, their hands clamped tightly behind their heads. Several elderly relatives, their faces etched with distress, were being manhandled by officers who exhibited little concern for their age or condition. The moment the first badge was flashed, any semblance of respect or decency seemed to vanish into thin air. Marcus, his heart racing as he observed how his family was being treated like common criminals, felt a surge of anger boil within him. His training as a high-ranking FBI agent had instilled in him the importance of remaining calm and composed in high-pressure situations, but this was different. This wasn't a tactical operation against dangerous suspects. This was a blatant attack on his family, conducted under the guise of law enforcement. He clenched his fists tightly, wrestling with the urge to physically intervene, fully aware that any sudden movement could escalate the already volatile situation. Abigail's voice rang out defiantly across the chaotic backyard as she continued to confront the officer's actions. "This is illegal. You can't detain us without cause," she declared, her words clear and authoritative, standing as a beacon of reason amidst the rising chaos. But her defiance only seemed to ignite the officer's hostility further. "Keep talking, and we'll make sure you're the first to go," an officer shot back, his hand moving dangerously close to the baton strapped to his belt, a threatening gesture that sent a ripple of tension through the air, intensifying the standoff between them. It was in that tense moment that Marcus's attention was drawn to one of the officers, whose aggressive demeanor stood out sharply against the backdrop of the gathering crowd. The officer was relentlessly patting down a teenage boy, one of the younger guests present. The boy, who appeared no older than 14, trembled visibly under the officer's rough scrutiny. His small hands were raised in the air, shaking uncontrollably, and despite his best efforts to maintain composure, he fought back tears that threatened to spill down his cheeks. "Get your hands off him," Marcus shouted, his voice echoing with indignation, unable to suppress the outrage boiling within him. He advanced toward the officer, his movements swift yet measured, driven by a strong sense of justice. "He's just a kid. There's no reason for this." The officer paused, glancing up with a hardened expression that conveyed a clear message of authority. "Back off," he warned, his tone laced with menace, "or you'll find yourself on the ground next." Marcus, undeterred by the threat, stepped closer, his presence imposing as he towered over the officer. "Enough," he said firmly, his voice steady and resolute, leaving no room for further discussion. "You're out of line." The air around them crackled with tension, the confrontation between Marcus and the officer reaching a boiling point. It was evident that conflict was about to erupt, but before either could escalate the situation, Abigail interjected. She placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder, gently yet firmly pulling him back. "Not like this," she whispered urgently, her voice steady, though Marcus could feel the tremor in her hands. "We can't give them an excuse to escalate things further." The officer smirked, an unsettling satisfaction playing across his features as he observed Marcus's momentary retreat. With one last shove, he stepped back, leaving the shaken teenager visibly distressed but, thankfully, unharmed. However, the incident had only served to amplify the palpable fear and anger that rippled through the crowd, creating an atmosphere thick with apprehension. The witnesses had seen enough to realize that the officers were not genuinely interested in resolving the situation peacefully. The sight of their loved ones being treated like common criminals was more than some could bear. A few individuals began to raise their voices, demanding answers and justice in increasingly forceful tones, their frustration rising as they confronted the officers. In response to the mounting resistance, the officers began to exhibit heightened aggression. One officer, drawing his baton menacingly, advanced toward an elderly woman who had been pleading desperately for the release of her grandson. "Ma'am, step back," he barked, his voice cold and lacking any trace of empathy. When she hesitated, her frail hands reaching out toward her grandson, the officer raised the baton threateningly, the tension escalating even further. Marcus, noticing the imminent threat, surged forward instinctively, catching the officer's wrist just before he could bring the baton down in a display of force. "You will not touch her," he said, his voice low and filled with an intense, simmering anger. The officer's eyes widened in a mix of surprise and fury, and in an instant, he erupted into a loud outburst, shouting for backup. "He assaulted me," the officer bellowed, his voice carrying through the yard, a desperate attempt to shift the narrative. "Get him down." Within moments, several officers rushed in, forcefully shoving Marcus back. The scene erupted into chaos, with guests attempting to intervene, some yelling at the officers to stop, while others fought to protect their loved ones from the escalating aggression. The police response was swift and brutal. Marcus was quickly overpowered and forced to the ground, while Abigail cried out in horror, witnessing her husband, a man who had devoted his life to serving and protecting others, being treated as though he were the perpetrator of a crime. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 4 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. Desperate to reach Marcus, Abigail tried to push her way through the fray, but she was intercepted by 2 officers who blocked her path with cold, unyielding faces. "You're obstructing justice," one of them said dismissively, his tone flat and devoid of compassion. "Step aside," Abigail shot back, her voice rising with an intensity fueled by anger and desperation. "This isn't justice. This is a blatant violation of our rights." The weight of her emotions threatened to spill over, and she could feel the heat of tears welling up in her eyes. Yet, in that moment, she forced herself to stay resolute, determined not to show weakness in front of those who sought to undermine her. This situation was far from over, and she was not about to back down. As one officer reached for her arm, a surge of adrenaline coursed through her veins. She twisted out of his grasp, her expression fierce and defiant. "Don't you dare touch me," she warned, her voice steady but laced with raw emotion. For a brief moment, the officer hesitated, taken aback by the intensity and fire in her eyes. That flicker of uncertainty quickly dissipated, however, as the other officers closed in on her. One officer seized her wrist and twisted it behind her back, while another swiftly produced a pair of handcuffs, the metallic clinking echoing ominously in the tense air. "You're under arrest," he stated, his voice devoid of empathy, and the words hung in the air, echoing with an unsettling finality that sent chills down her spine. In that harrowing moment, as Abigail was restrained, she glanced over at Marcus, who was still struggling against the officers holding him down. The sight of her husband, the man who had always been her protector, now being treated so unjustly tore at her heart, a pang of anguish slicing through her resolve. She bit back a sob, refusing to let them see her break. She would not give them the satisfaction of witnessing her despair. The chaos around them escalated as the officers began arresting other guests, showing no mercy to anyone who dared to voice their discontent. The atmosphere grew increasingly oppressive, with even children being pulled aside and threatened with detention if they did not comply. A sense of helplessness washed over the crowd, palpable and suffocating, as if the very air had thickened with dread, extinguishing any hope for a peaceful resolution. Amidst the turmoil, Marcus, pinned beneath 2 officers, managed to lift his head and meet Abigail's gaze. "Stay strong," he said, his voice barely audible over the chaos, but imbued with a fierce determination. "We'll get through this." His words ignited a flicker of strength within her, and she nodded, trying to convey through her expression that she would not give up. Not now, not ever. However, as the night wore on, the cacophony of struggle echoed across the yard, revealing the grim reality they faced, a force that would not easily relent. What had begun as a joyous celebration had morphed into a scene of chaos and fear, where the bride and groom were being treated like common criminals. Abigail and Marcus were not only confronting the physical aggression of the officers, but they were also grappling with a deeper, more insidious battle against a system that viewed their rights as expendable and their voices as insignificant. As darkness fully enveloped the night, the once beautiful backyard felt more like a war zone than a place of celebration. The flickering lights from the police cars cast long, ominous shadows across the lawn, and the air grew thick with the echoes of shouting voices, an unsettling mix of anger and despair. For every command barked by an officer, there was a desperate plea from a guest or a firm declaration of rights. Yet, the more people tried to reason with the police, the more aggressive and hostile the officers became, their authority wielded like a weapon. Abigail, her wrist still cuffed behind her back, struggled to remain calm, despite the throbbing pain radiating through her arm. The officer who had restrained her had been unnecessarily rough, twisting her wrist to an agonizing angle before forcing her hands into the cuffs. Although she was no stranger to the law, experiencing such blatant disregard for justice firsthand was a bitter reality that was difficult to bear. Nearby, Marcus remained pinned to the ground by two officers. His suit, once crisp and elegant, was now rumpled and soiled from the struggle, yet his voice held steady, unwavering. "You have no grounds to arrest us," he asserted. His words strained but clear, ringing out amidst the turmoil. "We're not resisting, and we have committed no crimes. Release us immediately." One of the officers pressing him down glanced up with a sneer, his contempt palpable. "You people never think you're in the wrong, do you?" His words dripped with disdain, the underlying meaning unmistakable and infuriating. Before Marcus could respond, a commotion erupted from behind. Several guests had gathered, their voices rising in a united protest. "Let them go," they shouted, their words resonating with defiance. "This is wrong." Seizing the moment, Abigail turned her attention to the lead officer, whose gaze swept over the crowd, irritation growing in his eyes. She felt a renewed surge of determination as she prepared to voice her defiance against the injustice unfolding before her. "Officer," she called out, her voice rising above the clamor of the surrounding chaos. Her tone was both authoritative and urgent. "I demand to speak as a judge regarding the legality of your actions. You are not only violating our rights as citizens, but you are also infringing upon the law itself. The searches and arrests you are conducting lack any reasonable cause or valid warrant, which is fundamentally against legal protocol." The lead officer's jaw tightened visibly at her words, and he took a deliberate step closer to her, his icy gaze fixed upon her as he spoke. "Ma'am, this is a police investigation, and you do not have the authority to dictate how we manage it." He shot a glance at his fellow officers, a silent communication that underscored his position, before adding, "And just because you hold the title of judge does not mean the rules can be bent for you." Abigail's heart raced with frustration, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on her chest. She drew herself up as best as she could, even though her hands were restrained, symbolizing her determination. "I am not asking you to bend the rules," she asserted, her voice steady but imbued with a fierce conviction. "I am demanding that you adhere to them. You have no right to detain us, search us, or enter our home without a proper warrant." The officer's response was swift and brutal, his authority unyielding. "Get her out of here," he snapped, his impatience palpable. "If she wants to make speeches, she can do it from a cell." Two officers lunged forward, grabbing her by the arms with a roughness that was both alarming and humiliating. As they began to drag her toward one of the squad cars, the harsh grip forced her to stumble. She managed to steady herself, gritting her teeth against the pain shooting through her limbs. As she was being forcibly taken away, Abigail's voice rang out once more, sharper and more resolute than before. "You're only proving our point. This isn't law enforcement. It's an abuse of power." Meanwhile, Marcus watched with growing horror as his wife was manhandled toward the police cars. The sight ignited a torrent of anger within him, and he fought against the officers pinning him down, a surge of adrenaline fueling his struggle. "Get your hands off her!" he shouted, desperation breaking through the veneer of his composure. The officers responded by pressing him harder against the unforgiving ground. "You're not in control here," one of them hissed, his grip tightening around Marcus's wrists, sending a jolt of pain through his body. "So stay down." Witnessing his wife being treated with such blatant violence pushed Marcus to the brink of his self-restraint. No longer could he maintain his composure as an agent of the law. He was now just a man compelled to protect his wife. With a burst of energy, he pushed himself up from the ground, shaking off one of the officer's grips with sheer willpower. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 5 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. The movement allowed him to scramble to his knees. The officer who had been restraining him stumbled back, momentarily losing his balance. But he quickly regained his footing, drawing his baton and raising it threateningly. "I said stay down," he barked, advancing toward Marcus with a menacing glint in his eyes. In that critical moment, as the officer's baton swung downward toward him, Marcus instinctively reached up and blocked the strike with his forearm. The force of the impact jolted pain through his arm, but he held his ground, refusing to yield. "Enough of this," he said, his voice low yet filled with a controlled fury that demanded attention. "We have the right to defend ourselves." Other officers, witnessing Marcus rise defiantly, began to converge on him, their faces twisted in determination to subdue him once and for all. Abigail, watching this unfold from the edge of the yard, felt a surge of anger and fear that eclipsed her physical pain. She could not stand idly by and watch Marcus get hurt. She would not be rendered helpless in this fight for justice. Drawing on every ounce of her training and resolve, Abigail shouted over the chaos, her voice cutting through the turmoil with an unyielding clarity. "Stop this now. You are violating the civil rights of everyone present. This will not go unanswered." Her powerful declaration seemed to resonate through the night, momentarily halting the officers in their tracks. For an instant, silence fell over the scene, as if the weight of her words had momentarily stunned everyone into awareness. But just as swiftly, the lead officer regained his composure and barked orders to his men with renewed intensity. "Take them all in," he shouted, his voice booming with authority. "Charge them with obstruction and whatever else we can fabricate. If they want to fight, we'll give them a reason to remember tonight." The words rang out like a clarion call, igniting a fierce determination within the officers. They surged forward, redoubling their efforts to control the tumultuous scene unfolding around them. In their ruthless pursuit of order, several more guests were seized, their anguished cries of protest quickly drowned out by the authoritative shouts of the officers, which echoed ominously in the air. The chaos reached into every corner of the gathering, even ensnaring the innocent. Children were torn from their parents, their small, terrified faces filled with confusion and fear as they were led away to the side, leaving behind a trail of heartbroken cries that pierced through the frenzy. Amidst this turmoil, Marcus and Abigail found themselves overwhelmed yet again, pinned down by the unyielding grip of law enforcement. Each attempt they made to defend themselves was met with escalating force, the officers showing no signs of compassion. Amid the struggle, Abigail's heart sank as she caught a fleeting glimpse of one of her elderly relatives being shoved roughly toward a waiting squad car. The sight was further compounded by the image of a small child being forcibly pulled away from his mother, tears streaming down his cheeks in a heartbreaking display of fear and desperation. The emotional toll of the scene ignited a deep-seated rage within Abigail. "You think you can treat us like this without consequences?" she spat, her voice a potent mix of pain and fury that cut through the chaos like a knife. "We will not be silenced. We will not be intimidated." Her defiance, however, only seemed to incite the officers further. One of them, intent on quelling her rebellion, shoved her roughly to the ground. The impact sent a sharp jolt of pain coursing through her shoulder, but she resolutely refused to let them witness her weakness. Summoning every ounce of strength, she struggled to her feet once more, her determination fueling her rise. As the situation escalated, it became evident that chaos had spiraled beyond anyone's control. What had begun as a joyous celebration filled with laughter and camaraderie had morphed into a harrowing ordeal, marked by brutality and gross injustice. Abigail and Marcus, once brimming with hope and happiness, now stood resolutely against a system hell-bent on breaking their spirits. Their fight had transcended the personal. It was no longer just about their freedom. It had become a rallying cry for all those who had suffered injustices that night, a chance to expose the rampant abuse of power and stand up for everyone who had been wronged. As the chapter drew to a close, Abigail and Marcus remained steadfast amidst the chaos, bloodied yet unbowed, their eyes ablaze with a defiance that refused to be extinguished. They understood that the battle was far from over. Even as they faced the cold, unyielding stares of the officers surrounding them, they held on to a fierce resolve. They would not surrender, no matter the cost. The air crackled with an electric tension as Abigail and Marcus stood defiantly amidst the chaos. Bruised and restrained, they found strength in their unbroken spirits. The flashing lights from the squad cars cast a harsh glow on their determined expressions, illuminating the anger and despair echoing through the night as guests watched helplessly. Their joyous celebration tragically transformed into a nightmarish reality. The officers, believing they had seized control of the scene, were blissfully unaware that the tide was about to turn. As Marcus fought to regain his breath from the rough handling, he caught Abigail's gaze. In that brief moment, a silent understanding passed between them. They had been pushed to their limits, and it was now time to unveil their true selves, not merely as victims of this egregious abuse of power, but as individuals of significant authority in their own right. It was time to confront the officers with an undeniable truth they could not ignore. Abigail, her voice ragged from the effort of shouting, straightened herself with as much dignity as she could muster, despite the pain radiating through her body. "You think you can do this without consequences?" she called out, her words slicing through the commotion with fierce clarity. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The lead officer, a towering figure who had orchestrated the aggressive actions, stepped forward, his expression a disconcerting blend of irritation and smugness. "Lady, I don't care who you think you are," he sneered dismissively, his tone dripping with condescension. "You're under arrest just like the rest of them." With a fire ignited in her eyes, Abigail's resolve crystallized. "I'm Judge Abigail Turner," she declared, her voice resonating with unmistakable authority that cut through the chaos. "I have served on the bench for over 10 years, and I know the law better than anyone here. What you're doing is not only illegal, it's a gross violation of our civil rights." Her words hung in the air, challenging the very foundation of the officers' actions and demanding acknowledgement of the truth they could no longer ignore. The night was still young, but the struggle ahead loomed large, one that would test their resolve and redefine the very fabric of their lives. The revelation struck the lead officer like a punch to the gut, leaving him momentarily speechless. For a fleeting instant, the self-satisfied smirk that had adorned his face faltered, giving way to a flicker of uncertainty. He cast a furtive glance at the other officers nearby, some of whom exchanged uneasy looks that suggested they were beginning to grasp the gravity of the situation unfolding before them. But Abigail was far from finished. She turned her unwavering gaze to Marcus, who, despite being surrounded by officers, had managed to maintain a composed posture. "And this is my husband, Marcus Turner," she declared, her voice growing stronger and more resolute with each word. "He's not just an ordinary citizen. He's a high-ranking agent with the FBI." The weight of her proclamation felt as heavy as a stone, creating a ripple of shock that cascaded through the crowd. Even the guests who had known the couple for years were taken aback, unable to fully anticipate the profound impact this revelation would have on the atmosphere. The officers, however, were rattled. They exchanged looks of disbelief and discomfort, visibly struggling to process the implications of what they had just learned. The lead officer's demeanor shifted, his face darkening with barely concealed anger. "You think your titles make you untouchable?" he snapped, desperately attempting to regain control of the situation. "That doesn't change anything. You're still interfering with an ongoing investigation." "Interfering?" Marcus's voice remained calm, yet it held a dangerously sharp edge that cut through the tension. "You call this an investigation? You arrived here without a warrant, harassed our guests, and used excessive force against unarmed civilians, including children and the elderly. Do you believe that won't come back to haunt you?" If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 6 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. His words hung in the air like a chilling wind, piercing through the heat of the confrontation. The other officers shifted uneasily, some casting glances toward the squad cars, where several guests were still being held without justification. It was evident that the confidence they had entered was beginning to waver. Seizing the moment, Abigail pressed further, her determination unwavering. "Everything you've done here has been recorded," she asserted, gesturing toward the crowd where multiple guests had been capturing the entire incident on their phones. "Those recordings are already being sent to the media and our legal team. This situation is no longer within your control." The lead officer's face flushed a deep shade of red, a mix of rage and humiliation washing over him. He took a step closer to Abigail, lowering his voice to a menacing whisper. "You may be a judge, and he may be an agent, but out here, that doesn't mean a damn thing." Unflinching, Abigail held his gaze, her resolve unwavering. "We'll see about that," she replied coolly, her confidence radiating. "Your actions tonight will be scrutinized by more than just this department. An investigation will ensue, and I assure you, heads will roll." As if summoned by her words, several guests who had been documenting the unfolding chaos began to raise their voices in support of Abigail and Marcus. "She's right," shouted a man from the back, his voice filled with indignation. "You can't treat people like this just because you have a badge. Let them go." Another woman joined in, her voice strong and determined. "They haven't done anything wrong." The growing outcry seemed to shake the last vestiges of control the officers had over the situation. Some of the younger officers, visibly unnerved, began to retreat, while others whispered anxiously among themselves, their earlier bravado dissipating in the face of mounting public scrutiny. Recognizing the shift in momentum, Marcus seized the opportunity to take charge of the narrative. He turned to the officers, his expression steely and resolute. "If you want to salvage what remains of your careers, you'll release everyone right now and walk away. Otherwise, I promise you, every one of you will be named in the lawsuits that are on the horizon." The weight of his threat hung heavily in the air, and for the first time that night, uncertainty crept into the expressions of even the most defiant officers. It was as though they were beginning to grasp the reality that this was not merely an isolated incident. It was an explosive scandal waiting to erupt. The tension in the air was palpable, and the power dynamic had shifted, leaving the officers on the defensive as the crowd rallied around Abigail and Marcus, emboldened by their stand. One of the older officers, a man with graying hair and a weary look etched into the lines of his face, stepped forward, his demeanor embodying the weight of years spent in a profession that often blurred the lines of right and wrong. "This has gone far enough," he said quietly, his voice laced with a hint of regret that hinted at a deeper understanding of the situation at hand. "We need to de-escalate." The lead officer, his youthful features twisted in incredulous anger, rounded on him with an intensity that seemed almost desperate. "De-escalate? They've been resisting us this whole time." His voice was sharp, as if he believed that raising it would somehow justify his stance. However, the older officer stood his ground, shaking his head slowly, a gesture filled with quiet resolve. "No," he replied, his tone firm yet measured. "They've been asserting their rights, and we've been willfully ignoring them. We need to back down." His words hung in the air, a sudden calm settling over the scene like a soothing balm after a fierce storm. It was a stark acknowledgement of a truth that had been there all along, one that could no longer be swept under the rug or denied. As the gravity of his statement resonated, the other officers began to lower their weapons, easing their grips on the restrained guests as if a collective realization had washed over them. Gradually, the atmosphere shifted from one of impending violence to a fragile and uneasy truce. Abigail and Marcus stood together, their hands still bound, yet their resolve remained unbroken. They had revealed their true selves, not merely as individuals defined by their titles and positions, but as fierce advocates who refused to be silenced in the face of overwhelming injustice. They stood resolutely against the abuse of power, courageously exposing the arrogance of those who believed they could act without consequence. As the chapter closed, the officers began to release the guests, the weight of what had just transpired hanging heavily in the air like a thick fog. Abigail and Marcus remained steadfast, fully aware that while this immediate battle was drawing to a close, the broader fight for justice was only just beginning. The ramifications of that night would ripple far beyond the confines of the backyard, resonating throughout the legal system and the court of public opinion. The officers began to retreat from the restrained guests, their expressions a complex mix of shame, anger, and fear. The older officer who had called for de-escalation offered a curt nod to his colleagues, signaling them to start removing the handcuffs from the guests, including Abigail and Marcus. The tension in the air began to ease, but the atmosphere was still thick with the heavy burden of the events that had unfolded. As Abigail rubbed her sore wrist, now free from the unforgiving metal cuffs, she felt a rush of relief that was intricately woven with a steely resolve. The damage had been done, and no amount of unshackling their guests would erase the profound trauma of the night. She exchanged a knowing glance with Marcus, who was also being liberated from his restraints. The same fire of determination burned brightly in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement that they both understood. Justice needed to be served. The guests gathered around, forming a protective circle, checking on one another, and offering comfort to the frightened children who had been separated from their parents. The scene, though calmer than before, still bore the remnants of chaos and fear, a palpable tension lingering in the air. Several guests continued to film, capturing every moment as a testament to the events of the night, their cameras rolling as if documenting a crucial piece of history. With a surge of authority, Abigail stepped forward, her voice resonating with the weight of someone who knew the significance of her words. "We are not finished here," she stated, her tone reminiscent of a judge delivering a final verdict in a courtroom. "Every one of you who participated in this unlawful conduct will face the consequences. There will be an investigation, and your badges will not serve as shields against accountability." The lead officer, who had embodied the hostility throughout the night, struggled to muster a final defense, his earlier bravado fading. "You people were resisting," he protested weakly, though his voice lacked the conviction it had held earlier, now just a shadow of its former self. "We were just doing our job," he added. But the words fell flat, no longer a rallying cry but a feeble attempt at justification in the face of undeniable wrongdoing. "Your job?" Marcus interrupted, his voice slicing through the tension with sharpness and palpable contempt. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to terrorize innocent people at a private event. You acted on baseless accusations, allowing your prejudice to dictate your actions. That's not law enforcement, it's an abuse of power." As Marcus's words hung in the air, their weight sinking in, the officer's earlier defiance began to waver. The tension in his jaw tightened, betraying his frustration. He opened his mouth, perhaps to retort, but before he could articulate a response, another officer, the one who had initially called for de-escalation, stepped forward, clearly recognizing the need for intervention. "It's over," the older officer said softly, his tone lacking the bravado that might typically accompany an officer in his position. He cast a somber glance at Abigail and Marcus, an expression of regret etched into his features. "I'm truly sorry. This never should have happened." The apology lingered in the air, sincere but ultimately insufficient to mend the damage that had been done. Abigail held his gaze, her expression resolute and unyielding. "You're right," she replied, her voice steady. "It shouldn't have. And now, there will be consequences." Word of the incident had already begun to spread beyond the confines of the backyard. The recordings captured by guests had gone viral, quickly gaining traction across various social media platforms and attracting the attention of news outlets. Within mere hours, what had begun as a private celebration would morph into a national headline, stirring outrage and igniting conversations across the country. The legal ramifications of the altercation began to unfold almost immediately. With the unwavering support of their influential families, Abigail and Marcus wasted no time in filing formal complaints against the officers involved. The footage from that fateful night, which starkly illustrated the blatant misuse of force and the violation of civil rights, became key evidence in the mounting case against the police department. The community, galvanized by the events of that evening, rallied around the couple, demanding justice and accountability for the egregious actions witnessed. Investigations were launched at both local and federal levels, each one probing deeper into the circumstances surrounding the incident. Marcus' connections within the FBI ensured that this inquiry would not be relegated to obscurity. The actions of the involved officers faced rigorous scrutiny, and their records were meticulously examined for previous incidents of misconduct. What had started as a routine neighborhood disturbance call had now evolved into a full-blown scandal, one that extended far beyond the purview of a single police department. If you are still watching this video and find these stories useful, please comment number 7 below to let me know that you are still watching this video with me. Thank you for your valuable time. The lead officer, who had exhibited the most aggression during the confrontation, was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the investigation. As the details of his previous record surfaced, complaints of excessive force and racial bias, it cast a long, dark shadow over his career. Several other officers involved in the incident were also suspended, their actions now subjected to intense public scrutiny. Meanwhile, the story of the wedding-turned-nightmare resonated deeply with people across the nation, sparking vital discussions about police reform and the pervasive issue of racial bias within law enforcement. Abigail and Marcus found themselves unexpectedly thrust into the spotlight, at the center of a growing movement aimed at challenging the systemic issues that had allowed such abuses of power to persist unchallenged. In the weeks that followed, the legal process began to unfold in earnest. Abigail and Marcus, alongside their dedicated legal team, prepared to take their case to court. Their objectives were twofold: to seek justice for the harm they and their guests had endured and to set a precedent that would deter future misconduct. They were determined to ensure that both the officers and the broader system that had enabled their behavior would be held accountable for their actions. As the courtroom doors opened, it transformed into a battleground for truth and justice. Witnesses from the wedding took the stand, recounting the terror they had experienced and the excessive force employed by the police. The recordings from that fateful night were played for all to see, vividly illustrating the indiscriminate aggression directed at unarmed civilians, including vulnerable children and elderly individuals. This stark evidence left little room for the defense to argue that the officers' actions had been justified, solidifying the foundation for a case that sought not only personal retribution but systemic change. Abigail took the stand, embodying more than just the role of a victim. She presented herself as a formidable legal expert, a voice for justice that commanded attention. With unwavering confidence, she detailed the numerous legal violations that had been committed that fateful night, articulating not only the specific breaches of protocol, but also the profound and lasting impact these actions had on everyone who had been present. Her testimony resonated with power and clarity. A judge who had previously experienced the brutal consequences of an abuse of power, now using her voice as an instrument to condemn such acts. The courtroom was a sacred space for her, where she transformed her pain into a rallying cry for accountability and reform. Marcus also took to the witness stand, drawing on his extensive background as a seasoned FBI agent. He shared his insights into the essential protocols that law enforcement officers are trained to follow, highlighting the myriad ways in which the officers involved deviated from these standards. His testimony was not just a recounting of events. It carried the weight of a man who had dedicated his entire career to upholding the law with integrity and professionalism. Marcus spoke with authority, illuminating the dangerous implications of the officers' actions and the breach of trust that had occurred, underscoring the critical need for adherence to established procedures designed to protect the community. The case garnered substantial attention far beyond the courtroom, with civil rights organizations, community leaders, and concerned citizens coming together to show their unwavering support for Abigail and Marcus. The trial transcended its immediate legal implications, evolving into a potent symbol of the fight against systemic injustice. It united people from various backgrounds and walks of life, all rallying behind the call for meaningful reform in policing practices and accountability measures. Ultimately, The jury rendered a decisive verdict in favor of Abigail and Marcus, affirming their claims and holding the officers accountable for their misconduct. The court ruled that the officers had violated the couple's civil rights, employing excessive force and demonstrating clear racial bias in their actions. In a landmark decision, the police department was ordered to pay substantial damages to Abigail and Marcus, while several officers faced disciplinary actions that included termination from their positions and potential criminal charges. Among those charged, the lead officer faced allegations of misconduct, effectively marking the end of his career in law enforcement. With the verdict announced, Abigail and Marcus emerged from the courthouse, flanked by a throng of supporters and surrounded by a sea of media cameras. The journey to reach this moment had been fraught with challenges, heartache, and tireless advocacy, yet they stood victorious, not solely for themselves but for every individual who had ever been unjustly targeted or oppressed. They recognized that while this victory was significant, the fight for justice was far from over. Still, they embraced the moment as a vital step forward in their quest for systemic change. Abigail turned to the crowd, her voice steady and resolute as she addressed her supporters. Today, we stand together to prove that no one is above the law, not even those who are sworn to enforce it. Our journey does not end here. We will continue to fight for justice, not just for ourselves, but for every person who has been silenced, mistreated, or ignored. This is only the beginning. Her words echoed with a promise of perseverance and a commitment to advocacy that would resonate beyond the courtroom. Marcus stood proudly beside her, his arm enveloping her shoulders in a protective embrace as they faced the eager cameras and the supportive crowd. The ordeal they had endured had tested their resolve and fortitude, but it had also solidified their commitment to each other and to the broader cause they had come to champion. As they walked away from the courthouse, hand in hand, they were acutely aware that their struggle had made a tangible difference, that their story would serve as a beacon of hope in the ongoing battle for equality and justice. As this chapter concluded, it left behind a sense of triumph and a renewed determination to confront the injustices that still lingered in society. The fight had not been easy, but it had been undeniably necessary. As Abigail and Marcus moved forward, they carried with them the profound knowledge that their courage and resilience had played a role in fostering real change and inspiring others to join in the fight for justice. Thank you for joining us on this transformative journey of spiritual encouragement and guidance. Today, we explored profound themes of faith, resilience, and divine love, reminding us of the strength we possess within and the support we receive from a higher power. As we reflect on the insights shared, we invite you to consider: what have you learned so far? Take a moment to think about one key takeaway that resonates with you, something you feel inspired to practice in your daily life. We would love for you to share your thoughts in the comments below this video. Your reflections not only help you internalize the message, but also inspire others who are on similar journeys. If you found value in this video, please show your support by liking it, sharing it with friends or family who might benefit, and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Together, we can continue spreading these uplifting messages of hope and love. Your engagement means the world to us and helps us reach more hearts seeking guidance and encouragement. Thank you once again for being a part of our community. Remember, you are never alone on this journey. God is always by your side.